Hello, my name is Drew. I'm part of the team at Risen Church, and we get together every weekend in Powhatan, Virginia, to talk about Jesus, raise questions, to pray together, to share with each other, and then I get on YouTube a couple of days later, and I talk about the other day. Thanks for checking this out today. We're in our third week of talking about Are You Helping? Where we're sort of asking this question that we all sort of asked of ourselves at some point. Am I actually contributing to the greater picture? Am I making a difference? I hope that I'm helpful, but is my helping helpful? Are the ways that I'm trying to help actually helping? And so hopefully we've been able to get into that a little bit. And I want to continue that conversation by looking at a place in Galatians, again, a letter that the Apostle Paul writes to a church, a group of people who are gathering together to talk about Jesus in a place called Galatia. And he tells a story about a friend of his who was not super helpful for a very specific reason that may actually be a bit of a stumbling block for us too. It might actually be one of those things that makes it difficult for us to be helpful too if we're not fully aware of what it is that he's talking about as being the issue. He says in Galatians chapter 2, verse 11, when Peter came to Antioch, so this is Paul talking about a friend of his, Peter, whenever he shows up on the scene in this place called Antioch, I had to oppose him to his face. That's so preachery of Paul. I had to oppose him to his face, for what he did was very wrong. When he first arrived, he ate with Gentile believers who were not circumcised. I know, right? But afterward, when some friends of James came, Peter wouldn't eat with the Gentiles anymore. He was afraid of criticism from these people who insisted on the necessity of circumcision. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to a party where you had to be on like a list to get in. But these people are throwing parties where you can find out whether you're on the list by like lifting up your tunic, I guess. I don't know. That's inappropriate, but this is YouTube. There are no rules here, really. But that's what's happening. I mean, that's what they're saying is happening. This is how they tell if someone is a Jewish person. If they're actually if they've been reconciled to God, they have this physical procedure that they do on men. And so Peter is hanging out with people and essentially teaching that doesn't really matter that much, that God isn't as religious as people are, and he's not as religious as people think he is. But then his friends show up, and he changes his tune whenever they show up. As a result, verse 13 of what Paul says, as a result, the other Jewish believers followed Peter's hypocrisy. Even Barnabas was led astray. Now, you may not know any of these people. Those names may not ring any bells for you. I don't think it even matters for you to get the essence of what is actually happening here. Paul is saying Peter shows up to a place where he wants to help some people know who Jesus is. He wants to live in communion with them. He wants to share the gospel and make a difference in their lives. And he asks no questions, really. He just shows up and he teaches and he eats with them and he enjoys their company and he's with them. But then some of his more religious friends show up on the scene, and Peter becomes really religious again. Peter backpedals on his own gospel message. Paul gives this clear depiction of a temptation that we're all going to be tempted to fall into whenever it comes to helping people. And it's not exactly the kind of temptation that we're mostly familiar with. It's not the one that we think about the most. Most of the time, whenever we think about temptation and dealing with people who are maybe hurting or caught up in addictions or caught up in ways of living that aren't best for their lives and they want to do better for their lives. And Paul warns us in Galatians chapter 6, verse 1, he says, make sure you don't fall into the same kinds of temptations that they are in. mostly we think of it as like, well, yeah, because they're sinning and having fun, and sinning is having fun. And so if I want to help them stop sinning, I'm going to get real close to that sinning that they're doing, and I might be tempted to have some fun doing that sinning too. But that version of things doesn't exactly align with what Paul is teaching in the greater narrative of Galatians. It doesn't exactly align with what he's already taught in Galatians chapter 2. It doesn't. The greatest temptation that Paul seems to be interested in steering people clear of and warning us of, if you're going to be trying to help people, is there is a temptation to want to lead people from one captivity, their sin, their addiction, their brokenness, their debt, their whatever, to lead them from one captivity to another. Your religion. There is a temptation among Christians to want to lead people from one captivity, their sin, to another captivity, our religious systems and structure. The primary sin that Paul appears to be concerned with delivering people from and keeping us from delivering people into in the book of Galatians is the sin of being enslaved to a religion. A sin of wanting to discount what faith in Jesus actually means. I want to offer you a couple of quick warnings on this particular topic that I think Paul highlights for us pretty well. If we really want to help people in meaningful ways in our lives, what are a couple of questions or a couple of ways that we can think about how to be helpful? One, if what you're doing to help others is actually helping, you will be tempted to stop constantly. I mean, that's one of the first things. Peter, when he was actually helping, was tempted to stop when his old religion showed up. Anything worth doing is difficult if you're actually playing a part in setting people free. You are setting them free from something, and there will be resistance. The old ways that Peter falls back into, they're not fun, live however you want because nothing matters version of life. He's tempted to fall back into religion. He's trying to drag people back into religion. He falls back into captivity. He falls back into trusting in a system of belief that makes God's love small and fickle and conditional. That is the draw that he's being drawn back to. And so I would just encourage you to consider that helping people is difficult. It's complicated work sometimes, and there will be resistance. And then Galatians 2, continuing in verse 14, Paul says this, "When I saw that they were not following the truth of the gospel message, I said to Peter in front of the others, 'Since you, a Jew by birth, have discarded the Jewish laws and are living like a Gentile, why are you now trying to make these Gentiles follow the Jewish traditions? You and I are both Jews by birth, not sinners like these Gentiles.'" That part hurts my feelings just a little bit, being a sinner, Gentile. "Yet we know that a person is made right with God by faith in Jesus Christ, not by obeying the law." When I read this to our church family on Sunday, they all audibly gasped and said, "Wait, what?" All of them. Now, I asked them to before I read it in the room, but I still think they were pretty shocked by it. "We have believed in Christ Jesus so that we might be made right with God because of our faith in Christ, not because we have obeyed the law. For no one will ever be made right with God by obeying the law." The second sort of warning that I would hope that we would kind of see, and that I think Paul lays out for us throughout the book of Galatians, and in particular in Galatians 6, where we've kind of been drawing from for this "are you helping" concept. If we're inviting people to trade one form of captivity for another, we're not helping. And this has just often been the case for the church. This is a draw for us. There's a gravitational pull for us to want to become, and I don't think this is going to be a shocker to you, and if it is, get ready to gasp. There's a temptation for Christians to become the world's moral bullies. There's a temptation for us to want to be everybody's moral police. We have often made it our aim and our goal not to get people to the feet of Jesus, not to get people to the gospel, not to get people to the good news, but to get people to act more like the ways that we want them to act. It's a real temptation, but if we're inviting people to trade one form of captivity for another, inviting them to trade an addiction, a bad pattern of living, a way of life that is not best for them, for the captivity of a religious order that makes God's love small and fickle and conditional, we're not helping. So let's take all of this back to square one, where we started this conversation. Galatians chapter 6, verse 1. Dear brothers and sisters, if another believer is overcome by some sin, and we've already defined sin in this conversation in a previous video. Sin is, by my own admission, I know what to do. I know the right way to live. I know the best way to live, and I'm not living it, and I wish I could. I need some help getting there. Then you who are godly, if you see a brother or sister like that, should humbly and gently help that person back onto the right path. And be careful not to fall into the same temptation yourself. Is this a warning really from Paul to say, don't get too close to people who are living sinful lives, because it's a lot of fun to live a sinful life and you're going to want to live it too? Maybe that's a little bit. I know that's the most traditional approach to understanding this stuff. But I think Paul is warning against something much trickier than that. Much more of a stumbling block. I think he's warning, don't fall into the temptation of religious thinking. Don't fall back into that old way of believing that you are made right with God by how good you are at being religious, by how good you are at following the rules, by how good you are at checking all of the right boxes. That Paul would say, as you're helping people, as you're showing up in their lives, as you are contributing, as you are lifting them up, as you are helping lead them away from destructive ways and into better ways, make sure you don't fall into the temptation of being their moral bully, their moral police. Make sure that your primary aim is to point them to the love of Jesus and to allow him to do the work of showing them what might need changed and showing them what might actually help in their lives. And in doing this, in becoming those kinds of people, I think we might be helping. I think we might actually be able to make a good difference for people.